Hmm. Good morning. The reason why we often avoid feeling our feelings when it comes to diving more deeply into ourselves is that we're aware that having to feel feelings, having to go through the direct perception of what it is that's at the root of our avoidance, of our shame, of our guilt, and all the other maladies that end up conspiring to keep us in a state of ill health, ill position, ill poise, requires transformation. That from the current place of psychological residence, we're unwilling to even conceive of as being the future or eventual nature of our being. That is to say, coming to terms with the truth of who we really are. Mental illness, all mental illness, that which is categorized as mental illness is what? It's disease, right? Disharmony, inner disharmony. And if you go down to the root of it and you see that the only moving through it is transformation, well, that very transformation is what the initial seed of the mental illness was born in resistance to. So there's always some, not just some, but there's always incredible resistance inwardly wherever there is mental friction to the reality, to the truth of who and what we really are. So, to whatever degree you are resisting surrendering to the truth of what and who you really are, to the true self, there will be what we refer to as mental illness, psychological dysfunction. It's a resistance to truth. And the most basic cover over that truth is fear, which is the most primordial fear, which comes out as the fear of death, the fear of ostracization, the fear of marginalization, the fear of being unloved, the fear of being abandoned, the fear of being rejected, which the cover over that is shame, guilt, and piled on top of that are all the other manifestations of that same base stuck energy, which is arrogance, greed, pity, um, self deprecation, whether you have a superiority complex or an inferiority complex, it's the same thing. This comes out as narcissism, it comes out as borderline personality, etc., etc., etc. And these are all sheaths. All of the diagnosable mental illnesses, mental maladies, are all sheaths. They're layers. They're programmed layers which cover up, which are there as a cover over the true self. And the only way to actualize what's been called actualizing the true self, which can only come after or in tandem with self realization, which requires the willingness to not only perceive what you are, to feel it, but to embody it, to allow it to be, to allow it to express itself dynamically and truly, without forcing anything to express in one mode or avenue or another, or without retracting and withdrawing and suppressing the allowance of the natural flowering, the natural expression of who and what you really are. And so the difficulty, the reason why we have all of the defense mechanisms that we have built up over the years, which we use to keep distance between ourselves and others, which is the same thing, the exact same thing as keeping distance between who we really are and who we're presenting as, who we're pretending to be, is because you know that it's impossible to feel the reality of the dissonance between who you really are and what you pretend to be for the sake of maintaining a false sense of social equilibrium without being in deep and incredible suffering. Because who and what you really are is immutable. And what you pretend to be, the posturing, the display, the show that goes on out here, is mutable. And when that which is mutable attempts to cover up indefinitely or permanently that which is immutable, the only result can be incredible internalized violence, trauma, which is the same thing. Trauma is violence, violence is trauma. And when you hold on to that and you live as that, all you can do is spread that. It'll seep into every corner of your being, physically, emotionally, mentally, energetically, and everything you touch will be laced with that poison. And so when you finally decide that you're ready to give that up, you don't want to live that way anymore, then that requires a complete internal transformation. No longer holding on to any of those poisonous implements that once upon a time were used as a barricade, keeping yourself safe from the world or from the external environment, which demanded the initial conformity to begin with. But if you have a wall that is keeping you on the other side of the other or of the world, that wall is a physical manifestation of the wall that you have erected inwardly between you and yourself. So, whatever is the situation with the so-called other, who or whatever the other is in your mind, whether the other is in terms of gender or in terms of race or religion or culture or deity, it doesn't matter. Whatever the other is in your mind, that you have a wall or a dividing line demarcating between you and that, you and them, that is a mirror image of the dividing line that you have drawn inside of yourself between you and yourself. And so the only way to transform, the only way to return to the wholeness of yourself is to tear down that wall. And the actual feeling of doing that and going through that, let's call it experience for now, or it's often been called reintegration or integration, ultimately you see that those words are rather meaningless in the sense that once you allow yourself to have that so-called reintegration, what you see actually is that the true self, the real self, was never broken, was never split. And so we have a lot of talk, a lot of jargon around this process of so-called reunification, reintegration, in the different spiritual sectors and fields. In the shamanic, the neo-shamanic realm, for example, there is a lot of talk around retrieving lost soul fragments. And that's a metaphorical way, it's an allegorical way of speaking. The soul cannot be lost, it cannot be fragmented, it cannot be broken. That's a fact. Anybody who says otherwise has never seen it, you see? And so people come upon this language, this very flowery, mythological language, soul retrieval, retrieving the lost pieces of a broken soul, and it resonates psychologically. And therefore people say, oh yes, this is true, because it resonates psychologically. It only can resonate psychologically because it's a mirror of the state of the fractured psyche, not of the soul. The psyche is fractured. The psyche is fragmented. The psyche is broken. That's a fact. Because thought is fragmented. Thought is fragments. Thought itself is a heap of fragments. And when you have an image of yourself, good, bad, ugly, beautiful, indifferent, doesn't matter, it's a mosaic made of the different fragments of thought put together. And so therefore it's always crumbling, it's always falling apart. You have to do constant maintenance on it. It's never good enough because it's always cracking and falling apart. And so if you're living as the psychological structure, then you have a feeling of always having to keep it together because everything's always falling apart. And the deepest fear is just letting it all fall apart. Now I'm going to tell you a secret. Let it fall apart. It's supposed to fall apart because it's not you. And if you let the psychological structure that you've spent so much time building and guarding and keeping safe, if you let it fall apart and let everything come rushing up to meet you, what you find is that underneath that image of brokenness, underneath the image of fragmentation, underneath the image of being lost and hurt and wounded and suffering and traumatized, sometimes beyond one's belief of reparability, what you find is that the real you, the true you, was always there under the surface, whole, complete, unbroken, unfragmented, untouched, and untouchable. And this is the only way out, to realize this. And so this is why you're often told to admonish to feel your feelings completely. But that's not enough. You do have to feel them. You have to feel everything. There's nothing you can hide from feeling. As long as you're trying to hide from feeling something, you will remain stuck and isolated in that little tiny cavern, that little box that you've built for yourself, or that you adopted from some tradition or some group or some tribe. It doesn't matter. You've adopted a bunch of pieces that are in the form of a box, a cave, an alcove, a keep of some kind. And to feel the origin of all of that, why that's there in the first place, is not simply to sit there in feeling eternally and suffering in that. It's to feel the incompatibility of the entire structure that is that keep itself, but also everything that is implied by it, in terms of all of the apparently external social structures, which are all built in order to support that kind of living, fragmented, broken, isolated, which is the very fundamental structure of the civilization, the so-called civilization in which we live. And so you see then, really, to go beyond all of that, to return to the true self, is really to transcend or to transgress. It'll feel like both. The entire package of psychosocial inculcation, indoctrination, programming that you've been given and that everybody around you has been given. And so in order to feel really the feelings that are there and to actually sit with the implications of them, which if you do without moving or disturbing or suppressing or avoiding or evading or doing anything to try to make it go away, no numbing, nothing, what you end up viscerally coming into direct awareness of is the fact that you have to transform. That means your way of living has to change. That means you can no longer be untrue to who and what you really are. No matter what that is, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what that is, but who and what you really are, underneath the programming, underneath the conditioning, underneath the socially constructed beliefs and ideologies of what's right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. You have to be willing to surrender to the truth of who you really are underneath the conditioning, beyond the conditioning. And that will never go away. The conditioning is subject to modification. And this is what most people do, by the way, when they're going to therapy. They won't tell themselves this, but when you're going to therapy, most people, when they're going to a psychologist, when they're going to an analyst, when they're going to deal with something from a so-called psychological perspective, mostly what they're doing is simply modifying the programming, modifying the conditioning in order to make that conditioning, in order to stretch out the cycles of the conditioning. Because programming, the conditioning, the shield, the buffer, the sheath, is cyclical in its psychological movement. And the tighter those cycles, the more erratic and, let me say, insane or manic or just absolutely unfit for social living a particular individual will find themselves. And so when somebody is in that state of just absolute and you can't cope anymore with the coping mechanisms, it's because the spirals, the cycles of the revolutions of the programming, of the conditioning, are going so tight because it's so packed in on itself. There's really not much room left to go. It's become super, super tight. You're spitting out. Well, when you go then to some kind of psychological help, nowadays things are a little bit different because a lot of our therapists and so on are aware of, not all, in fact, we have a long way to go, but more people that are practicing therapy and psychology and whatnot are aware of the inner reality. They're aware of, now in the psychology world, it's often brought in through, Buddhist studies or through yogic studies, which is fantastic, it's fine. But the traditional way of being engaged in the psychoanalytical field, in that sphere, is to try to fix the social self or to modify it so that it is compatible with the very structure of society as established by, if you go down into it, what is truly that basic root of fear. And so there's an implicit schizophrenia, that is, there's an implicit split mindedness implied in the very practice of classical psychology, in that it's an attempt, largely, to get the limited self, the conditioned self, the programmed self, to behave in a way that is considered by popular standard normal or functional within larger society, which is itself a field of programming. And so the reason why you're there in the office of the psychologist to begin with is because there's something deep within you that realizes that that programming is false. But the job of the psychologist, traditionally, classically, is not to say, yes, you're right, the programming is all false, now let's go beyond it. Because that's not, the field is there, one, basically acknowledging the all-importance of the psyche and the permanence and the immutability fundamentally of the basic substance of the psyche. But what that is in terms of the field of psychology, in order for it to be anything that can be studied at all, is it has to be an object. And the very notion of you, of yourself, of your basic being as a psychological object is itself untrue. It's false. And that's the very basis of your mental illness, is that you fundamentally perceive yourself to be a psychological object, which can be analyzed, which can be operated upon, which can be modified, which can be changed. And that a psychological object, it simply doesn't exist. It's not what, that's the programming. When I say programming, I mean that's the conditioning. The conditioning of society is that you are this object. And this object can be modified, it can be changed, it can be worked upon psychologically. And if you go into that, what's being modified and worked upon is the conditioning itself, the programming. And so basically all that can happen through that lens of work is if you come in because you're spiraling, your circles, your cycles of psyche are so tight that you're spinning out and going crazy, then the only thing that can be done is to simply elongate the ellipse, right? To just bring the cycle into a bit of a larger revolution so that you don't feel yourself to be spinning out. And because the cycle then is stretched out and becomes longer, most people in this state feel themselves to be going in a straight line. Just like, the earth being large and spherical, when you're walking in your common perspective, people feel themselves that, to be walking on a planar surface, on a flat surface. And it's not until you're at the ocean, right, and where the horizon is just off without any kind of mountains or terrain, kind of, disallowing clear sight, and you see the mast of the ships kind of begin to sink down or raise up over the horizon, then you begin to see, it's actually spherical. And so it's the same thing with the so-called mind, with the psyche, with the whole package of psychological conditioning and programming. It's a circuit. It moves in a circle. It's circuitous. And you don't see it unless it's really, really going super, super tight. But then the whole social situation, psychologically, is one of simply then trying to elongate that cycle so that you can fit in properly at a typical job in the corporate field, or just have a family as is the typical social protocol. It's to get you back into the standard social protocol. But if you look at the very nature of the standard social protocol, it's however nice of a picture we try to paint, it's nice to have a job in this kind of a sector with benefits and security and a certain kind of income and, the nice bank account and the good house and the good neighborhood and the family and the children and all of that. And it's painted with a very nice, sentimental airbrush. But the fact of the matter is, all of those sectors are a part of the contributive ignorance that are demolishing the habitable biosphere in which we find ourselves as living beings. And so it's very nice, the idea of, you should be well enough to just, go get a good job with this and this and this and the other. But if you look at all of these sectors that comprise the institutions of our society that you are supposed to be, by the popular mythology, meant to be cognitively fit enough to participate in, all of those institutional sectors are actively contributing to the very degradation of the biosphere, of the environment within which we live, which is supporting the very basis of our biological being. And so, being so-called psychologically fit or cognitively fit by standards of psychoanalysis and psychological practice, right, in order to be a so-called participatory member in our society, which means going with the status quo, you're going with the economy, you're going with its flow, with its implications, and all the rest of it, means to resign yourself to being part of what is fundamentally the deeper problem, which is anyway contributing to the fact of all of the psychoses and neuroses in the apparent individual patients that go into the practice. And so when you step outside of the whole system completely, that means when you refuse to be a participatory member at all, which requires going beyond your own conditioning, which can't be done unless you let everything fall apart. And then when you stand aside, you see that there is no individual separate from the whole. The world, the structure of the world, is the individual. The individual is the structure of the world. The world and the individual are one. The world and the person are one. So there's no such thing as individual isolated mental illness. The so-called mental illness of the individual is the mental illness of the world. And the mental illness of the world is the mental illness of the individual. They're not separate. They can never be. But that's the fundamental lie, is that your mental health is a personal problem, right? It's individual. It has nothing to do with the world. And there's an even subtler trap in that, because even though mental health is global, the personal is the global is the personal, to be willing to see that, to feel that, and to return right back to the question, well, what is all of this psychological disturbance covering up? Because the psychological disturbance is movement, and that movement is a cover. All movement is a cover over stillness, right? And obviously, no matter within your own being, no matter how much psychological, emotional movement is occurring constantly, which is distraction, it's movement, which is distraction, it takes the attention everywhere, in order that the attention does not have to come to rest on that which is eternally and immutably still within oneself, which is the truth of who you really are. When you allow everything to be totally still, and you put your attention on that which is eternally still and quiet and silent inside of you, then you see the difference immediately between the immutable and the mutable, between the permanent and the impermanent, between formless and form, between what's eternal and what is temporal. And without this basic and direct perception within your own self, there can't be any mental health. There can't be. There can be a pretense of mental health. There can be a feigning of mental health. There can be a checking off of the psychosocial boxes, or the psychoanalytical boxes, proffered forth by this particular school of thought or that particular school of thought. But you can check off all the boxes for a so-called good life or an outwardly appearing healthy life without there actually being true inner peace, without there actually being inwardly a profound sense of harmony and awareness within yourself, and therefore with what appears outside of you as the environment and the other people that appear in your daily life, whether family or friends or strangers or coworkers, it doesn't matter. People, beings. So The question then, really and truly, is do you want to go all the way? Are you willing to go all the way? Which means, are you willing to go totally beyond the limited, beyond the conditioned, beyond the programming? Are you willing to fall headfirst into the void, into that space inside of you which is undemarcated, unknown, and yet when you dive into it, you see it is actually known, but not as an object of thought, not as an object of memory. It's known in a much more direct way, as the truth of who and what you really are. But it can't be said. It can't be wrapped up in a nice box with a bow. It can't be said. And therefore it can't ultimately be totally expressed or seen. And so all of life then is really seen to be an attempt to express the inexpressible in terms of form. And because it's impossible, there's always novel form appearing and appearing and appearing and appearing, cropping up, cropping up, cropping up. And so you see then that the world of form, the manifest world of form, is basically an infinite attempt or an endless attempt at the expression of the formless in terms of form. And because the formless by its nature has no beginning and no end, no birth, no death, but form by its very nature has a beginning and an end, a birth and a death, it's measurable. The formless is immeasurable, form is measurable. And so what is of form can never be permanent. Never. And what is formless is eternal, is permanent, is absolute. And as a human being not simply, you're not merely endowed with consciousness, you are consciousness. There is always, in consciousness, being formlessness itself, is always aware of itself. And so being identified with form, the form of thought, the structure of thought and memory, which is the conditioning, the programming, which includes the body, being identified with that, there's always a feeling of disquiet. There's always a feeling of missing something. There's always a feeling of not enough, not enough, not enough, not enough, not enough, right? Whether I'm not enough or whether I don't have enough, it's the same thing. Because you identify with what you have. When you're identified with the thought structure, with the ego, with the personality, with the conditioning, with the programming, with the body, you identify with what you have, with what you own. And so the feeling of not being enough is the same feeling as not having enough. It's the exact same thing. And so you're trying to be enough, you're trying to acquire enough, to have enough. It's the same impulse. It's the same movement generated by the programming, by the conditioning, in order for the conditioning to feel whole and complete within itself. But that's the trap, because the conditioning, the programming can never feel whole, can never feel complete, can never feel like it's got it on lock. It can never. Only the formlessness, which is itself whole by its very nature, can never feel that self-satisfaction or that self-fulfillment of being whole and complete and without need or want. Because form always has need, always has want. That's the nature of form. Form has need, form has want. Form is desire. Desire as the desire for this, or desire with an object, that is form. Form is object, object is form, and subject and object are one. So, in seeing the nature of this, then there's the capacity to carry it well, to handle it well, without being caught up in the ignorance of unawareness of the nature of the cycles, thinking that it's going somewhere when in fact it's just spiraling like this. So a radical new approach to the way that we handle mental health and deal with mental health is absolutely in order. Because unless our systems of mental health really come to regard and see the fact, the truth, that what we are is known in the formless, conscious awareness of being itself, and that what we are is not the psychological structure, what we are is not any piece of form or object awareness or subject awareness. form, particularized form awareness. Here's me and here's you. Here's my depression, there's your depression. Here's my anxiety, there's your anxiety. Until that fundamental flaw in perception is removed, there can only be cyclical repetitions within the predetermined patterning of conditioning, of programming, which is what we call disease or mental illness. And it's directly related to, it's the very same structure which underlies the very economic and political social structure within which we've been living for not just the last 100 years, but for thousands of years now, tens of thousands of years even. And so it's an ancient game that we're playing, it's an ancient trap. And our conscious evolution forward is in the recognition, the realization of this trap. Otherwise, there's a whole lot of talk and methods and games being played and false solutions being proffered in the name of healing, in the name of getting better, in the name of making progress, which make the mind feel good temporarily because it gives the mind a false sense of hope. But the reality is, until there's actually a deep dive into the inner core of formlessness, into the inner core of who you really are, beyond the programming, beyond the conditioning, beyond even then the desire to be a good programmed being, or a good anti-programmed being, it's the same thing. As long as there's a desire to try to fit in with any kind of social milieu whatsoever, that is going to be, however destructive you think you are. You might even think, well, I'm terribly destructive and I want to not be, and my understanding of that is to be able to fit in well with this group or with society at large or whatever, so therefore I've got to try to conform to that. The sickness will remain. It will simply be submerged. It'll simply be suppressed, numbed, coerced into a different form. But truly, I tell you, there's no healing. There's no healing unless there is a total and complete untethering, unbinding, unleashing of the conditioned program self. It simply cannot be, it cannot happen. And the very psychological structures that have been the pillars of our mental health paradigm heretofore, because of the very nature of the mission statement of those paradigms, are absolutely incapable of really serving ultimately the purpose of the liberation of the being. Because the liberation of the being implies the complete collapse of our entire civilizational structure as we currently understand it. Because our current civilizational structure is based on exploitation. Our religious institutions are based on exploitation. Our scientific institutions are based on exploitation. Our artistic, unfortunately now, institutions are based on exploitation. Our technological institutions, our pharmaceutical, medical institutions are based on exploitation. Our whole economy is based on exploitation. All of the family is based on exploitation. Everything, marriage is based on exploitation. Relationship in general is based on exploitation. And so our food industry is based on everything. Every aspect of our living today, institutionalized, sanctioned, canonized by our civilizational structure itself, which includes the government, everything. It's all based on exploitation. And so our very sense of self and who we are in the world is based on exploitation, trying to avoid being exploited while trying to exploit another. So basically, to put it in simpler layman's terms, everybody wants to kill, but nobody wants to die. Everyone's willing to sacrifice somebody else's life, but nobody wants to sacrifice theirs. And that basic cognitive dissonance, which is schizophrenia, that basic cognitive dissonance is what allows for people to be incredibly, terribly, violent and aggressive and just destructive in all the wrong ways, in the worst of ways, and then to turn around and cry and complain and wonder why everything is the way it is, you see? And it manifests in all facets of our lives. You go on social media, for example, and you see people, all over complaining about, things are where they are and it's terrible, and well, why did people do this? And I'm being very vague because I'm not interested in getting into any kind of partisan blah 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 blah. It gets beyond the point. The people that complain the most about why things are the way they are never seem to want to realize the part that they play in keeping things the way they are. And this is not meant for anybody in particular, it's meant for everybody. So the only way out of this mess is to immediately stop the blame game. Because as long as that is going on, that's part of the programming, that's part of the conditioning. So the only way out immediately is to drop into formlessness, immediately. Which means giving up hope that the form can be fixed, giving up hope that the form will be the salvation, that finding a new form given by somebody, modified by somebody, will be the saving grace, because the only saving grace is in the formlessness itself. And in formlessness, there's the direct perception that all form is created now. And that trying to carry old form, old patterns from the past into the present, identifying with those patterns, is the very root of violence, the very root of aggression, the very root of mental illness. So there must be a willingness to simply abide as formlessness, and then to see that form is there as a tool, form is there as a servant. Servant doesn't mean exploit. It means that it's used for the sake of formlessness. And so form is as needed. You create a form, you create a personality, you create what you could call an ego structure, you create your psychological tools as you need them out of the substance of thought itself, and then as soon as you're done using them, you simply let them go. You put them right back into the field of thought, let them dissolve back into nothing. And then the next time you need another, tool made of thought, you simply, right now in the present moment, you create it. And then as soon as you're done with it, you release it, you let it go. As opposed to carrying all these concepts and images and ideas and ideologies and philosophies and on your back, on your head. That's what makes you mentally ill. That's what makes you insane. That's what makes the society and the world insane. And so then everybody thinks they know something because this one has their philosophy and this one has their religion, and it's not even religion. It's, their particular interpretation of what they think the religion is. You see? And it's not even really, someone considers themselves, I'm not even going to mention anybody's names, but, people all consider themselves to belong to this school of philosophical thought, or that school of thought, or this school of religion, or this school of spirituality, or this school of shamanism, or this school of whatever. And that's all just that's your nonsense, forgive me. But that's simply the form language of the particular part on the path that you're walking. And if you actually let yourself go all the way, let yourself have it, you will be forced to go beyond form, which means you have to face death. You have to contend with formlessness, with the movement from form to formlessness, which we call death. And then find out what that really is by looking at it inwardly, by looking at it in the raw, without filtration, without fear. And so this is the problem, really, when it comes to actual, what we might call psychological transformation, is that to actually feel the feelings completely that we run from demands transformation. And so it demands inwardly going through the experience of death. Because you cannot inwardly have a realization of a psychological nature, really have a realization, and not transform completely the way in which you live. Otherwise, you're being untrue to your realization, and you'll feel that, and it'll only increase and exacerbate your mental unwellness. And you know that. And so people will avoid having insight, people will avoid having realization, because of the fact precisely that they know it will demand a change in their external way of living, and the internal, it's one and the same, but it'll require that they change their way of living, which they know will mean they have to confront certain forces or people in the outside world, because that means you have to tell the truth. And when you tell the truth, it upsets everybody and everything around you that insists upon living in the untruth. If everybody around you and everything around you is structured upon untruth, is structured upon running and hiding and resisting the truth of the self, the minute you allow yourself to perceive the truth of the self and live from that truth, then whoever does not want to face it, look at it, and live from it is going to, all of the so-called, what you'd call the demons, all of the ghosts, all of the aggressions, the violences, the defense mechanisms will just start roaring and pouring out and be directed at you, and you'll be perceived as the enemy, right? And you have to be okay with that, because you see where it comes from and what it is, recognizing that you were just there too, doing the same thing. And it's programming. So you can't, it's not to be taken personally. But if you would be a conscious being, if you would be a sovereign being, you have to face the programming, the fact of the programming, so that you know what it is. And when you face it directly and know what it is, you see how unconscionable it is that human beings should live that way. That a human being should make that choice for themselves, and that even worse, a human being should try to impose that upon another. You see how absolutely god-awful it is. It's the worst thing. It's not how human beings are meant to live. But that's how we've been living. And there's a requirement in consciousness, to say requirement, but there's an absolute necessity within consciousness that you feel that you see that you become aware of that. Because that's part of acting sovereign in a world in which unsovereignty is a possibility of choice. And then you see that choice of unsovereignty, which is the socially sanctioned choice of the civilizational structure in which we've been living for some time now, you see what a violent, awful thing it is. It's being a slave. We think slavery is done. It's not. It's not done at all. And to actually step out of it means to see, one, it requires the willingness to die. And therefore the willingness to face anything and everything, to feel anything and everything. Which is the capacity of consciousness. As a human being, you have the capacity to face anything and everything and to feel anything and everything. All at once. And it has to be felt all at once. You can't say, I'll feel a little bit today and a little bit tomorrow. Everything has to be felt all at once. And to the conditioned mind, it will say, that's overwhelming. It's only overwhelming to the conditioning and the programming. And if you allow it to pour into the programming completely, it'll actually break the programming. That's one way. Either you let everything come pouring in at once with the programming and it'll break the programming, because if you start letting everything pour in at once with the programming and you refuse to let the programming break, it'll just mangle it and mangle your experience of yourself, which may drive you even further into resistance. And so the other option is to simply allow everything within you to be emptied completely. But I mean everything, to leave nothing. And then anyway, everything will come pouring in. I mean everything that's real, right? Everything that is as it is, not just your selected, I'll let this in but not this, and I'll take this but not that. No, it's an all or nothing game. And as it turns out, everything and nothing are one and the same. It's all the in-between stages, which are just different versions of yes and no and yes, right? Selections, being selective, right? Inwardly, as to what you'll experience, what you won't experience, what you'll feel, what you won't feel. If you're cherry-picking your feelings, if you're cherry-picking what you'll feel and what you won't feel, then you have there's no chance. You have to feel everything, or feel nothing at all. And as long as you're, and to feel nothing completely then leads anyway to the feeling of everything. So, and if you think that sounds impossible, it's actually not only possible, but it's really the only possibility. Everything else is a resistance against that. And so living from a programmed, conditioned self is actually an attempt, it's resistance to the feeling of everything. Because you can. The human being is uniquely endowed with the capacity to feel everything all at once and to not go insane or crazy in the wrong way. It'll actually, the sitting here and feeling everything all at once is incredible ecstasy. It's incredible ecstasy. It just runs right through the whole system. And the resistance to feeling everything all at once is the deliberate solidifying yourself into a psychological form object, which is itself suffering. And so going through, hell and out the other side then requires being open to feeling everything, which means to knowing everything directly, which means total non-resistance. When I say knowing, I mean to be in direct contact with what is in every way that you possibly can be. And that is the unique station and capacity of the human being. That's what it is to be human. It's not some lofty, abstract pipe dream. It is the reality of being human. Being in the conditioning and the programming, that's the pipe dream. And believing that its projections into the future are real or obtainable in any meaningful, grand way. That's the pipe dream. The reality is the totality of consciousness. The reality is that which is contained in the eternal infinity of what we call the great void itself, which cannot be known as long as there is an image of it, which is part of the conditioning. The conditioning, the programming, has an image of that void, has an image of that vast open empty space as being the abyss, in the sense of, and that word abyss has a kind of a negative connotation to it. And so death is projected into that empty, open, vast space. Death as in the eternal ending of me, where everything's gone. But what you think you are is the body and the programming, the psychosocial conditioning, which we call the mind, or the ego, or the personality. And the body will obviously come to an end. That's clear. And the conditioning itself had a beginning, so it will clearly have an end. It has to. But it's the conditioning itself which projects its image onto the void and then calls it something bad, when the reality is then clearly whatever you see when you look into the void, if you see some object, something to be frightened of, that is the very projection of what your conditioning actually is. So it's not the void, it's not the unknown that's to be eschewed or that is the problem, it's the known. The unknown is not death. The known is death. The known is death. The psychological conditioning is death. The psychological programming is death, not the void. The void is not death. It's only death in the true sense of the word, in that there's no form in it. It's not form. And in order to cross from form to formlessness, there has to be that dissolution of form, which is what we call death on the one hand, but death actually is stepping into that total, complete, eternal deathlessness. And so going through the gateway of death is stepping into deathlessness. But the false death, which is the rot and the putrefaction and the atrophy, right, the suffering, that is not the product of or coming from the void or the eternal or the unknown. That is the result of conditioning. That is the programming, the conditioning of the mind. And it projects itself into the void. So to actually know what the openness is, what the emptiness is, you have to throw yourself into it completely. Mind, body, spirit, everything. You have to throw yourself into it completely. Which means the willingness to lose everything. That means the risk inwardly, the feeling of the risk that you have to take is, I'm going to lose my mind, I'm going to lose my body, I'm going to lose everything that I've ever accumulated, everything that I've ever known, everything. I'm going to lose everything. That's the feeling of the risk that's taken when you jump into the void. And that's the risk that has to be taken to be a full human being and to be able to walk in freedom while you yet live, while you're alive, to be in total inner freedom of being the true self. That's the initiation, that's the gateway, that's the portal that has to be jumped in. And every human being must go through that, and every human being has the capacity to go through that. That's what it means. That's what it means to be a human being. Being human means that you have the unique capacity to be aware of the experience of a body and a mind in manifest form, while simultaneously being aware of yourself as infinite, eternal, formless presence. You get to be aware totally of the divine and totally of the human, totally of the form. That means you get to be aware totally of the formless and totally of the form. That's the unique gift and capacity of the human being. And when one lives as the programming, the psychosocial programming, you get neither. You don't even, you're living as conditioned form, which is not the totality of form, it's a small part of form, and therefore never even knowing form. And so the programming, the ego, the personality, the conditioning never knows itself, never can know itself, let alone its origin, the formless. But if you're here as formlessness, then you get to know both the formless and the form. And this is what all human beings are uniquely equipped and capable of. There's not a single human being to whom this awareness is disallowed. If you're here and you're incarnate as a human being, congratulations. It's a very, very auspicious birth, and you have the capacity, the unique capacity in this cosmos to, as far as we know, right, to be able to know this. And even if there are other beings in bodied form that also have the capacity for this, that is absolutely irrelevant to you here watching as a human being to know this yourself. So you have the capacity to know formlessness and form. And this is what it is to be a human being, and it's this awareness that allows for the experience of there's an individual body, and it's, everything implied therefrom, its experiences and so on, and that what we are here in formlessness is one consciousness. And so therefore in that, there's the seeing of the deep need for cooperation with the natural forces, the forces of nature, as well as with all of us here, human beings on this planet, and all creatures and life forms, which we can't do as long as we're locked in the programming. Because if you're in the programming, then you're only able to exploit for your own survival, because then the survival of your body and of your mental structure is the most important thing, even at the cost of other lives. And if everyone's doing that, then you clearly see where just all that can be is this artificially generated chaotic mess. Because the kind of chaos that human beings are afraid of is artificially generated. And so when there is this still awareness of the eternity of one's being, then there's the capacity to see what you actually are and what you're not. And therefore what you actually need and what you don't need, what nobody needs and what everybody actually needs. And then there's the capacity to be not only on the same page with other human beings, deeply without a word, to be on the same page in total silence, but to be on the same page with nature in silence, to be on the same page with the whole of the cosmos in silence, to be on the same page with consciousness itself in silence, to be on the same page with sacredness itself, with the divine, with divinity itself, with sacredness itself, in silence. And to realize that behind the scenes, everything is on the same page with that, in silence. And so this is the jump that we have to make. This is the leap that we have to make. And it takes all the courage in the world. It takes all the courage you've got. Because it takes the willingness to die. It takes the willingness to leave behind everything that is known. To go out into the unknown, to dive into the unknown completely without any safety rope. Without any promise or hope of ever coming back. That's what it takes. And every human being is endowed with this capacity. And it's only in doing this that one actually comes to life. Otherwise, one is just living as programming, which can only ever, as conditioning, which can only ever be ill, which can only ever generate what we call mental illness, which is not separate from all of the catastrophes and the strife and the violence and the trauma and the brutality and the warfare of the world. It's the same thing. To bring an end to the warfare inside of us is to bring an end to the warfare in the world. May all beings know peace. May all beings know the truth of who they really are and have the fearlessness to dive completely into it and live it freely, openly, beautifully. You are beauty. You are love. You are peace. You are joy. You are the living image of the divine. You cannot, nor have you ever been, separate from consciousness, from sacredness, from love, from peace, from truth. You cannot be. It is impossible. May you know this, and may on this World Mental Health Day, you know the peace that passes understanding, the joy of being, living in the truth of who you really are, without any need to prove anything to anyone. Not even to yourself. There's nothing to prove. There's nothing to prove. There's only raw, direct awareness. And either it's here in one or it's not in one because of the psychological resistance of clinging to the programming, of the conditioning. And to one who is caught, who is clinging to the programming, there's no capacity to prove anything to that one because that programming itself is made up of conclusions. And those conclusions being clung to disallow any clear seeing of any meaningful kind whatsoever. And to whoever is surrendered to consciousness, nothing needs to be proved because they anyway see clearly. You see, consciousness takes care of itself. Life takes care of itself. The beingness of what is, which is the source of everything, takes care of itself, and therefore takes care of everything that it is, and all form is made of that, which you clearly see from within the clarity of consciousness. And it's only the programming, it's only the conditioned ego, the conditioned mind, the conditioned structure of so-called reality that we've established here as the basis for our civilizational structure that would seek to withhold survival from anybody on the basis of disagreeing. With the very nature of the programming itself. You see? So it takes that total fearlessness, that total sovereignty of awareness, of perception, to step through all of the apparent gates that would stand in one's way to allowing oneself to stand here, to sit here, to be here as a free being. Free from the conditioning, free from the programming, free from the false beliefs of what it takes to live and what it means to be alive here as anything less than freedom itself, as anything less than joy itself, as anything less than love itself, as anything less than peace itself. May you know freedom.